In this video, we're going to be looking at a very common form of fallacious argumentation or inference called the fallacy of the slippery slope. And as usual, we're going to look at a number of different aspects of this. We're going to talk first about what it is at its core. We're going to talk about the structure of argumentation involved. We'll talk about why slippery slope is a fallacy. We'll analyze some common situations in which you can expect it to arise. We'll look at 3 examples of the fallacy. If you want to see further examples, we'll be uploading videos just focused on providing more raw material, more examples for you. We'll talk about how to spot the fallacy of slippery slope when other people are making it. We'll talk about when people get mistaken about it, and we'll also finish by talking about how to avoid engaging in this fallacy in your own reasoning, your own argumentation, your own communication. So let's talk first about what the fallacy of slippery slope actually is. And at its most basic, at its core, what it consists in is arguing that if you accept one small thing, this is going to lead ultimately to some terrible outcome. It could actually be, reworked so that it had a positive outcome, but it's almost always in terms of some terrible thing that you want to avoid. And what's really essential to it is that you have to go through a set of intermediary steps. So the idea is that there's a slippery slope because if you start out at point A, you're going to wind up down here at point whatever it is, point catastrophe. And you're going to pass through a number of different steps. And it's a fallacy when this isn't really the case or we have no reason to suppose it to be the case. So there could in fact be some cases where there actually is a slippery slope. It's a fallacy when we don't have good reason to think that beginning with one thing is going to lead us inevitably or most likely to this terrible outcome. So what is the structure of this fallacy? The way that it works, there are several different premises to it, and you have to begin with an if-then. So if you accept X, then Y follows. And X could be anything. X could be if you eat this cookie, it could be if you click on this link, it could be if you, take a puff on a joint, it could be if you go to college, pick whatever you like. But Y has to follow from X. And then we have a chain, and you could have more than 2 nodes in the chain, more than 2 if-then statements. You could have a whole link of 20 of them. That's pretty rare that you see it involved to that extent, but you could do that. So the next premise is more or less the same sort of thing. If Y occurs, then Z is going to follow from that. And here's where we get to the bottom of the slope. This could be an implicit premise or it could be an explicit premise. Z is a bad outcome that we want to avoid. So the conclusion of this argument is don't accept X. Don't take that first step. Don't begin the process because you're going to wind up at Z and you don't want to be there. So if we want to represent this graphically, here's how you could look at it. X is the first step, and if you do X, it's going to lead to Y, and Y, there's almost like a chain here. Y is going to lead to Z, and so if you accept X, you're getting yourself in for Z. And you notice I've got this slippery slope drawn in there because what it's saying is you could kind of cut out all these other steps. If you accept X, you're engaging in something that's tantamount to accepting Z, and Z is terrible, so we don't want that. Now, there's a few other things to say about the structure of this fallacy. There could be, like I said, many or few steps in the argument. Some of the steps might actually be assumed or implicit. They might not be spelled out because it could be assumed that the audience already is going to think along those lines. And the argument could take deductive or inductive forms. What I mean by that is if we're thinking in deductive terms, we're saying that if X, then Y must follow. If Y, then Z must follow. So if X, you're going to certainly or necessarily get to Z. That would be a deductive argument. It could also be weakened into an inductive argument where you could say, well, look, if you accept X, then Y is very likely or probable to follow. And if you accept Y, then Z is very likely to follow. So if you accept X, you're probably going to wind up at Z. There could be some exceptions, but we can make a good, guess or probability statement about this. Now, why is this a fallacy? It's a fallacy when the slope is not as slippery as it's being made out to be. The metaphor is, imagine that you're at the top of a hill that's covered with ice. You take that first step, you're going all the way down the hill. Now, perhaps that's not the case. If it turns out to not be the case, it's going to be because one or more of the connecting if-then premises are not true. They're not reliable. They're not something that you can say, well, you're going to slide from Y to Z. What are common situations in which you're going to see this coming up? So it comes up a lot in discussions and particularly in debates when people are getting heated, when people are trying to steer the audience away from their opponent. And it comes up in debates about policies, about risks, about possible expenses, and about consequences in general. It often comes up when people are assuming others or themselves can be led by steps towards a bad outcome. So in many respects, it takes the agency of the person out of the way. It says, look, if you do this, then that's going to lead you to this, and that's going to lead you to this. It treats people quite often as if they're not able to say at one of these intermediary nodes, wait a second, what's going on here? We need to move away from this. So it treats people somewhat as if they're predictable automatons. Let's look now at a few examples. Here's a classic example of a slippery slope. It's been enshrined even in movies. The idea is that marijuana is a gateway drug, and what they mean by a gateway is a gateway into harder drugs which are much more problematic, like crack or crystal meth or heroin or PCP. Pick whatever you like, whatever is going to ruin your life. And the idea in making this kind of slippery slope argument is you better not take a puff, because if you do, that's going to lead you to being this junkie down here, and you don't want to be them. So the argument often goes like this. If you try marijuana, you're going to get hooked on marijuana. If you get hooked on marijuana, you're going to start using harder drugs. And you don't want to use harder drugs because they're going to ruin your life. Therefore, don't even try marijuana. And by the way, I'm not advocating trying marijuana because, there's a whole bunch of reasons why I'm not for it, but that's a whole different conversation. What are the weak points in this? Well, you can actually point out several weak points in this. It's not that you don't want to use harder drugs. I mean, if you get hooked on heroin or PCP or crack or, pick anything of that magnitude, your life is pretty well screwed. So that one's probably true. But let's work our way back upward the slope. So if you get hooked on marijuana, are you going to start necessarily or even probably using other drugs like, cocaine or, meth or things like that? Some people do. But some people just keep smoking pot the whole time. And some people, they don't do the other drugs because they like pot so much. And they say, well, this is easy enough for me. Some places it's becoming legal. So that premise seems pretty questionable. Let's look at the higher up one. If you try marijuana, are you going to get hooked on it? Are you going to become an addict? There's plenty of people who have tried marijuana and didn't enjoy it and just dropped it. My parents were examples of that. I remember my mother telling me about how she tried pot and it just didn't taste very good, and all the people around her were acting kind of dumb, and she thought, this isn't for me. Other people try it and they like it, but do they become addicted in the way that people become, say, addicted to cocaine? That's debatable. So that's perhaps a weak premise as well. Let's look at another example. This is one where the slippery slope argument gets made a lot. In terms of civil liberties, if we allow any small violation of any person's civil liberties, it's going to embolden the state or the police or the government, or pick whoever you like, to violate more and more. And eventually we're going to be in a totalitarian dictatorship. Sometimes you even play the Nazi card with that. We're going to be just like the Nazis or just like the Soviets, depending on who you dislike more, or just like the North Koreans. Now, what's the conclusion? We must not allow any violation of any person's civil liberties at any time. Is this a good argument? It doesn't seem so. I don't want to say, by the way, that it's a good thing to violate civil liberties, but there could be occasions where it's necessary. For example, quarantining people if there's some sort of terrible infectious disease that's out, or monitoring communications. I'm not for what the NSA has been doing, but some degree of monitoring communications does seem to be, not just allowable under law, but even perhaps a good thing. So let's think about these, the one premise that we have here. If we allow any small violation of one person's civil liberties, it will embolden the state to violate more and more of them. Is that really true? Well, there's a plausible argument to be made there. But is it something that we can rely upon to get us to a totalitarian dictatorship? I don't think so. I think this is a fairly weak argument. I think this is an example of a slippery slope fallacy. Let's look at the third one, military escalation. Another common example. It's sort of like the good money after bad kind of cases. Should we throw good money into this, to try to fix the situation? And what does that, what connection is there? When do these sort of things come up? The idea is that you begin with some very small step, and that isn't enough, so you got to add more and more and more and more. Military escalation often proves to be like that. So here's how an argument like that might run. If we provide any military advisors in this particular conflict, that's going to lead to airstrikes. Airstrikes are not going to be effective enough. They're going to lead to putting boots on the ground because you ultimately have to hold territory. Sending in the troops is going to result in massive casualties for us, and we don't like that. So let's not send in any military advisors to this conflict. And we could imagine all sorts of, permutations and variations upon this. And these sort of arguments are often made. Now, is it the case that we can go from one of these to the next, to the next, to the next? Sending in troops will result in massive casualties. That one seems to be a terrible outcome if it actually occurs, but that one doesn't seem to be a necessarily true premise, or even probably true premise. What about the if-thens, though? If we provide military advisors in this conflict, will that lead to airstrikes? Kind of depends, doesn't it? It's not a guaranteed premise that we can say, aha, this will automatically lead to that, unless we knew that the policymakers, always send in advisors and then do airstrikes. What about airstrikes will lead to putting boots on the ground? Is that something that we can say 100% or even 99 or 98%? This is going to be the case. I don't think that's workable either. So what we have here again is a case of a slippery slope argument. Now, how do you spot it? How do you spot this fallacy when other people are making? Well, when you see claims being made that a small step will necessarily or probably lead to a very bad outcome, that should send up some red flags. You should start saying, wait a second, I don't know that taking, a step of this sort, like clicking on this button here, or saying hi to a stranger in an elevator, is going to lead to the world being destroyed. Now, this is very dramatic, of course, but you get the idea. You should look at these sort of things. When you see a really bad outcome being postulated as the likely outcome, if you do this seemingly small thing, you probably have a slippery slope fallacy going on. What you want to do then is keep an eye out for the connecting links between the small step and the outcome. You also want to be aware of any implicit premises, a lack of explicit links. If it seems like, how are you getting from here to here so quickly? That's probably because the person is making a bunch of inferences along the way. And if you make those explicit, quite often that person themselves might say, "Oh yeah, now I see this is not a very good line of reasoning here." But even if they don't, even if they stick to their guns, you're at least equipped to say, "Aha, now I see where the weaknesses in this inference lie." So what's not the fallacy of slippery slope? This is not a fallacy that, in my experience as a teacher of critical thinking, I've seen often confused with other fallacies. So that's the good news. But the bad news is, once a person becomes aware of the fallacy of slippery slope, they often start to diagnose it where it's not being committed. Some slippery slopes do exist. So there's not a fallacy when you can go through a set of steps that do in fact lead to some sort of outcome. So, for example, if you go to your doctor and your doctor says, "I really think you need to stop doing this, because that's likely to lead you to this, and that's likely to lead you to this, and this is going to, eventually lead to your early death." And you say, "Well, you're committing a slippery slope, doctor." Probably the doctor's not. If there are real connections between these things, then you don't have a slippery slope fallacy, you have a real slippery slope. How do you avoid making this fallacy yourself in your own argumentation? Well, if you're arguing from some initial step to a final outcome, you want to subject your own reasoning, your own logic, your own argument to scrutiny. And the way that you're going to do that is look at each part of it. Look at not just, is the final thing a bad thing? It probably is. Is the first thing a small step? It probably is. Look at all those if-thens. If you do this, then that's going to lead to this. And if you do this, that's going to lead to this. Pay attention to each one of them. Are these connections all as certain or as likely as you're assuming them to be? Or are you making them stronger than they really ought to be regarded as? And if you are, then why are you doing that? Is it that you're being motivated by fear? Is it that you're being motivated by the wish to get somebody to believe something? Does it fit into your larger system of beliefs? Perhaps you have other things to think about in that case. So that's a lot about this particular argument, this particular fallacy that you're going to see quite often. To bring things to a close, I want to tell you a little bit about this video and where it fits in. So this video is part of an entire series discussing common fallacies in reasoning and argument. And it belongs to this channel devoted specifically to critical thinking, to reasoning, and to argumentation. So if you enjoy this video or you find it useful, share it with other people and check out the other videos and series in this channel. They're all designed to try to make you a better thinker, a better reasoner, perhaps even a better communicator.